Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here at Western and in Canada. So this is a talk that's out of a larger project on the politics of difference, and this particular version or this particular part of the project has to do with the everyday nature of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. But actually, I don't want to begin in Palestine. I want to begin in Lebanon, at the border with Israel, which is kind of an amazing place. I've been there many times. I grew up in Beirut. My family's still in Beirut, so I go back all the time. And it's a kind of magical place because, first of all, it's one of the most beautiful parts of Lebanon. And secondly, despite or with its beauty, it's also obviously been marred by years of war and a couple of decades of Israeli occupation, which ended a few years ago. But still, to this day, if you go down to the south, you can see, despite the beauty of the landscape, the proximity of Israel, which has been busy putting up. It has this thing about concrete walls, Israel. I don't know why, but anyway, it's putting up this kind of concrete wall on the border with Lebanon. And elsewhere, you can see signs of fortifications and forts and just generally border markings that remind you, of course, of the proximity of Israel, even though psychologically, in a way, it seems also at the same time very distant. So the weird thing about this border space is that it's a place where proximity and distance actually seem to contact each other, to touch each other, and in a kind of, it's weirdly kind of disconcerting. So at certain places, when you look across the border, where you can see through the fence, you can see actual settlements inside Israel itself, inside the Galilee, which again, from a Lebanese perspective, certainly from a Palestinian perspective as well, is strange because, Israel in so many ways is necessarily, politically speaking, something of an abstraction. So when you have an abstract concept in your head, and you go down and you look at the physical manifestation of the abstract concept, it has a very strange effect. It's hard. It's not just hard. It's impossible to explain. I'm looking for words with which to explain this strange sensation of the proximate become, distant at the same time, and the abstract becoming also concrete. It's a very kind of strange, really almost metaphysical situation where you're literally seeing with your bodily eyes what would otherwise be a kind of almost metaphysical abstraction or political abstraction. So it's a kind of, as I said, it messes with you in a way. But the other thing that happens when you look across the border from Lebanon, and of course you see Israel, but then the other thing that happens simultaneously or interchangeably, which is also another weird thing, it's hard to describe, so I hope you bear with me, is that you also see Palestine, because of course that's what it is too, right? So there's this weird way in which look once and you see Israel with all of what that means from an Arab perspective, and then blink and look again and you see Palestine with all that means, also from an Arab perspective. And of course it's actually physically, it's the same space, it's the same landscape, it's the same site, it hasn't changed, it has changed, but I mean physically, geophysically, it's the same place. So again, it's a matter of making abstractions concrete and literally seeing abstractions. So when you see Palestine, of course, what can you think but that all of these years of war and displacement and struggle and demolition and bombing and people being moved around and expelled and massacred and so on and so forth, it all comes down to this sort of supremely banal landscape that, that again is almost impossible to kind of balance in your head with the massive nature of historical transformation and political transformation and, movements of population and displacements and refugees and the loss of life and so on and so forth. So, but then, as I say, with all of those things in mind, you look and you just see a beautiful landscape. And like I said, it's hard, or if not impossible, to reconcile those two things again. So for example, there's a place on the border where you go down, this is the Wazani River in the south of Lebanon, where you go down and you look at it, and it's a tiny little stream. This is in the summer, so it's even tinier than usual. And you just think, it's just a little bit of water, right? And this is a place where the border itself is a very complicated space, but this is one of those places where the Israeli fence is actually further to the south from where the border between Lebanon and Palestine actually is. So in other words, standing where I took these pictures in Lebanon, you look across the stream of the Wazani, and the land on the other side of the stream, which is no bigger than from me to you, is Palestine. And you just think, and the water is like this deep. So you think, well, I can wade across and I'll be in Palestine, which is also a very, very strange thought, to think that all that separates me from Palestine, with all that that means, is this tiny little 6-inch deep or 1 foot deep body of water, which is again a kind of strange experience. It's discomforting, it's unbalancing, it's troubling. It's exciting too, but it's also disturbing in its own kinds of ways. So I want to back out now again and look at that landscape from a kind of distance. And I want to talk about the ways in which we have a kind of double encounter with the landscape. As I said, look once and you see Palestine, look again and you see Israel. And it's that doubleness that's troubling. Because to look at the landscape, to see the landscape, if you read it correctly, is also, of course, to read the process of historical transformation that's took place and is taking place in Palestine and Israel. That is looking down from the border down into the Galilee. This is one of the most thoroughly ethnically cleansed sites in all of historical Palestine. It's a place where dozens of Palestinian villages were demolished and their populations expelled in 1948. This is a map of the Galilee with the red and blue dots representing villages, many of them demolished in 1948, and their populations expelled. So the place where I'm taking these pictures from, if we zoom in a little bit, is more or less on this side of the border, looking down this way. So you're looking down from on high onto this landscape, and part of the task here is to be able to connect this political, historical map with its marks of demolished villages with the landscape that you actually see, because it's the same. It's actually the same perspective. And in fact, if you were able to, and I'm not without tremendous difficulty able to, but if you were able to get to the land itself and go and see it and touch it and smell it and breathe it, you would go around these areas, like if you were inside the Galilee itself, you'd be able to see villages or the remains of Palestinian villages like this. This is the village of Abl al-Amah, which has been reduced, as you can see, to nothing but landscape because, of course, the people were expelled and their homes were systematically bulldozed and demolished. You can see the village of Zu al-Fawani, or again, the remnants of the village of Zu, which are still there. These pictures are contemporary pictures, so it's they mark the traces of the passing of history and the passing of an entire population as well, of course. You can see the village of Shaw al-Tahta and al-Khisas, and they're all there. So anybody who tells you that there were no Palestinians before 1948, you can take them to that landscape and say, well, here are the ruins of people's houses. Whose houses were they? Who do you think was living here? Who built these houses? And above all, what happened to the people that used to live here? Where have they gone? Well, that, of course, is, again, the history of expulsion and transformation and cleansing that we're speaking about here. But you can locate all those villages that I just showed you the pictures of among these dots on the geopolitical map. So if you go back to this kind of overview, what you're looking at here is a site where historical and political transformation have taken on the lineaments of everyday life, of the banality of everyday life. There's a kind of a simplicity, an obviousness, I don't know how to say it, a quotidian feel to it that is, of course, by definition, part of the basic nature of everyday life, but of course, at the same moment, in the same breath, it also speaks to this huge process of political and historical transformation and, of course, also tragedy. I want to shift now from the border and deeper into Palestine itself and to talk about the logic of the occupation, particularly for now in the West Bank, and to talk about the way in which, again, the land and the shaping of landscape has become one of the focal points of the contest between Israel and the Palestinians. The domination of the landscape by Israeli settlements, many people have remarked on this. I'm not the first one to do this. There's been a lot of excellent scholarship on the way in which Israeli architecture facilitates the domination of the landscape, visually, aesthetically, even sort of militarily as well, in terms of surveillance and observation and empowerment and those kinds of logics. So if you look at the landscape of the West Bank, again, you'll see, obviously, it's a place where people live their day-to-day lives. It is a landscape of everyday life, like all other landscapes. But again, marked by profoundly political processes that channel and shape the contours within which everyday life is lived. And of course, they do so as part of the planning mechanisms of the occupation. So for example, if you look at one of these maps, the UN publishes maps of obviously the whole space. This is a map of the area around the town of Qalqilia in the northwest of the West Bank. And if you look at the map, you can see how the UN has plotted where there's a Jewish population, where there's a Palestinian population, where the border is, where the wall is that the Israelis are constructing, how these things are all cheek by jowl by each other, next to each other, but at the same time, of course, systematically separated from each other. So here you see a landscape where the political logic of exclusion and separation and differentiation, the politics of difference, is systematically worked into architectural terms, into spatial terms, into terms that separate people from one another. So, of course, part of what's at stake here is Israel's ability to impose its vision of a splintered and fractured, a riven landscape and riven populations onto the landscape itself, of course. One of the big differences between Palestine and Lebanon is that there is no real military resistance in Palestine. There hasn't been for decades. And so Israel is much more able to impose its will on the landscape, unlike Lebanon, where it tried but ultimately failed to do so. So it really does control down to people's everyday lives, down to the minute details of everyday life, the rhythms of people's quotidian existence, where you can go, how you can go, whether you can go, how you're able to go, whether you can shop or cook or take your kids to school or get to school if you're a kid, or get to your farm or get to a clinic or get to your job or whatever. And so, in fact, one of the aspects of everyday life that's most under Israeli control, and again, this is something they have a kind of passion for, is the giant bureaucratic apparatus of the occupation, which is phenomenal and truly Kafkaesque in scale and scope. But there's a whole, alphabet soup of bureaucratic permits and passes and check things and all kinds of things you need to do to live your day-to-day life, all of which, of course, are determined by the Israelis, and all of which are also determined to facilitate life for Jewish settlers while immobilizing and paralyzing the conduct of everyday life for ordinary Palestinians. But if you look at identity cards, for example, it's possible to see, when you compare the identity cards of individual people with the nature of their ability to conduct their everyday lives. So if you look at these people that I'm about to flash on the screen, you probably can't tell at a glance which one is Palestinian and which one is Israeli, and you might even confuse some each for the other in some way. But in fact, these particular people, each person's ID card determines where he or she can go, how or whether he or she can get there, by what means, where he or she can work, where he or she can live, where he or she can travel, if they can travel, whom he or she can marry, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are determined by these ID cards. So you carry your ID card like the way we do our driver's licenses in your pocket. It's connected to you physically, but of course, it's the way in which, or one of the ways in which, this giant apparatus of occupation and segregation kind of literally grips your body and grips the ability you have to live or not live, to conduct your everyday life. It's the ID card is the site, it's the place, it's the focal point where the political, let's say, the political logic of occupation and of separation and segregation and differentiation manifests itself at the ultimate level of the everyday and of the banal in some point. So 6 human beings, 6 totally different arrays of possibility and rights and privileges, or lack of rights and lack of privileges, according to, as defined by the state of Israel. Some people can cross this landscape, for example, based on their ID card, freely. If you're Jewish, you can cross the landscape quite freely. In the West Bank, they've built roads that are specifically meant to keep the native population away, so you can come and go as you wish. And of course, if you are a member of the indigenous population, then of course there's a very different fate that awaits you in terms of your ability or inability to traverse what is, after all, your own landscape. So this is a shot of one of the many Israeli checkpoints. And indeed, people are restricted, faced with this kind of nightmare. People are restricted to other and indeed often older forms of transport, which suddenly in our postmodern age have become actually much more efficient, because it's easier to get around on the back of a donkey over the hills than to traverse the netscape, the network of checkpoints and roadblocks and so on and so forth. There's a really weird way in which pre-modernity becomes more advanced than modernity for Palestinians living under these circumstances. And if not, certainly your everyday movement, your every movement really, is blocked, circumvented, obstructed, shut down in one way or another. So if you go to any of the Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank, these are the kinds of scenes you see on a daily basis. People being channeled, their lives being corralled, disrupted. It looks like a prison. This is how Palestinians get from point A to point B when they're able to get. This is as good as it gets, when they're able to get from point A to point B, when there isn't a curfew or some other general prohibition on movement. This is what they have to go through to get from point A to point B. So again, the checkpoint becomes a site where the politics of occupation, the politics of difference, take on and manifest and shape the contours of everyday life for ordinary people. As of September last year, which is the last published set of statistics that I've seen, the UN documented 490 closures interrupting Palestinian but not Jewish movement throughout the West Bank. That includes checkpoints like the ones I'm just showing you, roadblocks, gates, earth mounds, walls, trenches, other kinds of barriers and obstructions, and so forth. So literally, the occupation structures everyday life from the inside out, from your ID card to your ability or inability to traverse the landscape, get to jobs, farm, school, your kids, etc. But it does other things as well. Look, for example, at this number, 2279. Some of you may recognize this as a number that Israeli planners came up with, and eventually they moved away from it because it made really, really bad press. But they came up with this number after calculating in Gaza the number of men, women, and children in Gaza, and the number of Gaza's ability. This is a few years ago, before the last round of bombing, but Gaza's ability to produce food, sustenance for the people living in Gaza. And then they calculated, what they came up with was the exact number of calories, 2,279, that literally on a per capita basis, that the population of Gaza needs in order to hover exactly at the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. In other words, the Israelis calculated the number of calories so that not to be too few that they actually plunge into malnutrition and starvation, but on the other hand, not too many that they're living a happy and normal life either. And so they spent, I don't know how long it took them to do this. Math is not my forte anyway, but somebody spent many nights, or many people, committees of people, spent many nights, calculating literally down to the individual truckload of chickens or eggs or whatever, pasta. How many calories do these people, what comes in and what goes out, and how can we refine what we allow to enter Gaza down to the exact calorie, literally the exact calorie. And if you think about what that what that says about the logic of the Israeli occupation and the forms, again, by which large political abstractions, like we want to control a population, think about that's an abstraction, that's an abstract idea, but it comes down to the level of what we take for granted in North America as the most banal thing. You go into a grocery store and you look at the nutrition facts on the back of a packet of cereal or whatever, and it gives you the calorie breakdown, right? But in Israel and Palestine, this is part of the bureaucratic apparatus of occupation and separation and of course, differentiation. So there's a way in which even we can speak of an alimentary occupation, occupying people's stomachs, their digestive tracts, their ability to gain or their lack of nutrition. It depends, of course. And of course, along with that, there are other forms of where the abstract makes contact with the concrete, literally, and the real. For example, Israel's long-standing policy of home demolition. It is, as far as I know, the only state in the world that, as a matter of routine established procedure, no other state does this, systematically, methodically bulldozes family homes on a routine basis, pretty much day in, day out, or every other day, or certainly every week. It's something that Israel does methodically and systematically. It's been doing it since 1967, since 1948, really. But in the West Bank and Gaza, more methodically since 1967. Uprooting and burning not just people's homes, but of course also their trees, their farms, their belongings, and so on and so forth. And sometimes this is done by the Israeli army. Sometimes it's done by Jewish settlers living in the West Bank that are kind of unleashed by the army, and the army kind of watches them do what they do without taking any kind of intervention. According to the UN, in the past year alone, 600 structures have been demolished so far by the Israelis in the West Bank, displacing around 1,000 people, and of course making life impossible for Palestinians in the West Bank, never mind, of course, Gaza, which is subject to not just this kind of one-by-one home demolition, but large-scale destruction of entire neighborhoods and bombings. Same thing goes, of course, for East Jerusalem, where even while Israel concentrates on building new housing for new Jewish residents of the city and the occupied areas around it, it systematically demolishes Palestinian houses at the same time. In the past few years, according to the UN, the Israelis have demolished over 2,000 Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem alone. So if you just think about the way in which people are moved around, their homes demolished, permits are not granted to them to build, they're disconnected from electricity networks often, and sewage networks and water networks and so forth and so on. It's extraordinary to see how, as I said, an abstraction, that is to say, we will take this land must be our land, we will colonize, we will settle the land, right? These are all forms of linguistic abstraction, but they take concrete form when it comes to literally cutting up this woman's olive trees or groves, or destroying her house, or bulldozing her husband's house, or whatever. In the past few years, in the past decades since the occupation of 1967, the United Nations estimates that the Israelis have uprooted or demolished 800,000 olive trees in the West Bank, which is a huge proportion of one of the major agricultural modes of life for Palestinians in the West Bank. I want to shift now away from the occupied territories and to within Israel itself, because often, if you know anything about the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, some people make a differentiation between the events of 1948, that is the forcible expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in 1948, and then the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem in 1967. And a lot of people say, if we can resolve somehow through a two-state solution or whatever, if we can resolve the occupation of 1967 and establish a Palestinian state and the territories occupied as of 1967, then everything will be okay, we can find a peace settlement, etc. But that, of course, ignores what happened in 1948 and what continues to happen to Palestinians who survived the ethnic cleansing of 1948 and who remain a minority inside their own homeland. Palestinians constitute about 20% of the population of the State of Israel. They're citizens, nominally anyway, but they definitely live a kind of second-class life, juridically, institutionally, and otherwise. But what I want to talk about in this particular juncture isn't those kinds of abstraction, it's rather, again, the way in which abstraction takes concrete material form. So, again, if you know anything about this conflict, you will have heard about the way in which Israel prides itself on making the desert green and on greening the landscape, which, of course, in our era of environmental disaster, catastrophe, the global warming, etc., greening sounds like a great thing, especially these days, right? But the interesting thing about the way in which the Israelis green is that it's woven directly into their policy of ethnically cleansing not just the people, but kind of the landscape itself, if you will. So if you go to the website of the Jewish National Fund, pretty much on the front of the website, you'll find all this stuff about I don't know how much money to plant a tree in Israel. And they take pride, and you often go, people talk about they gave money to have a tree planted in Israel, because Israel makes the desert green, et cetera, et cetera. And they make a big deal about afforestation, sort of planting forests inside Israel. And they look pretty, et cetera, from a distance, as long as you don't scratch too deep beneath the surface. Because the interesting thing about the forests that the Israelis, and in particular the Jewish National Fund, have been planting, is that they have been used systematically to cover up the traces of demolished Palestinian villages. So actually, what looks like a greening project is actually, in fact, is inseparably, seamlessly, also part of the project of ethnic cleansing that the Israelis are all about. So you can see many places, especially in the Galilee, but elsewhere too, where these are the ruins of a Palestinian village, and you can see trees have been planted around the village and in the village, between the houses and in the houses, the ruins, basically to kind of cover it up through greenification. And there are many, many such sites. In fact, many of the forests that the Jewish National Fund has planted have been planted exactly in and among the ruins of villages in order to make them go away. This is the most stunning one, I think. It's a picture of the ruins of the Palestinian village of Safuri, as it was before its people were expelled in the 1940s. Sorry, the picture's from the 1930s, but this is before, obviously, the explosions of 1948, and as it was about 10 years ago or so. And you can see what's happened is by planting all the trees, the village kind of magically goes away. So we have this beautiful green landscape, but of course, don't mention the people who used to be there and their homes, and what happened to them, and what their fate is, and how all of this works, and how, in fact, even a forest can be thought of as a device for ethnic cleansing. It's kind of an astonishing fact. So, if we go back to that shot with which I began the talk, taken from the border of Lebanon across into Galilee, when you look at all those forests don't actually belong. I mean, not like this anyway. They don't belong in this landscape in the Galilee. They're not. The trees that they're planting are not indigenous trees by any means. They plant trees that need a lot of water and grow really fast, precisely because that's the work that they're supposed to do. But if you go to the villages that I was pointing out, you'll see systematically, and not coincidentally, trees all over them, again, to disappear them, to make them go away as much as possible. But the point is that we can talk about this in terms of what happened in 1948. And like I said, several hundred Palestinian villages were thus demolished in 1948 by the Israelis, and in the early 1950s, more systematically wiped out. And then, trees were planted in their midst to make them go away by greening them. But it's also something that's happening literally to this very day to Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, within the state itself. I'm not talking about the West Bank or East Jerusalem or Gaza. I'm talking about citizens of the state within the state. And I want to tell you about the village of Araqib, which is a village of about 300 Palestinian Bedouin in the Naqab Desert in the south of the country. They're all Israeli citizens. They belong in one of there are many of these villages. They're called, they're thought of as unrecognized villages. These are villages that, for the most part, predate the establishment of the State of Israel, but don't appear in any of the state's official planning documents because the state post-dates them and then conveniently didn't include them in maps and documents and so forth for zoning and this kind of thing. So as far as the state is concerned, the villages don't exist. So they're called unrecognized villages, which means they're also not connected to the water grid, electricity, phones, schools, the mail system, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting about Araqib, it's not unique by any means, is that it's become kind of a focal point for the obsessive Israeli calculation about home demolition and Palestinian resistance to that same process. So it's a site, again, where political abstractions are being contested at the level of the everyday in this one tiny, I mean, a village of 300 people, as you can imagine, is a very, very small place. It's not a big place, and it's, as you'll see in a second, even smaller than it used to be. So it's this village in the south. The Jewish National Fund was allotted a forest to be built, to be implanted in where the village is now. So in 2010, in the summer of 2010, about 1,300 Israeli police officers descended on the village with bulldozers, and they oversaw the demolition of the village. And so Araqib was demolished in 2010. But the strange thing about this story, as I said, is that the Palestinians resisted it. And they resisted in this particular case by rebuilding the village after it was demolished. So the Israelis demolished it in July, I think it was, July 2010. And then the Palestinians rebuilt it. And then the Israelis re-demolished it, and the Palestinians rebuilt it. And the Israelis re-demolished it, and the Palestinians rebuilt it. And the Israelis re-demolished it, and the Palestinians rebuilt it. I can go on saying that. As of the last time I checked, which was a couple of weeks ago, 83 times since 2010. So if you think about what it means for a village to be demolished and rebuilt 83 times in, 5 years, coming up in 5 years, that's a pretty astonishing statistic, I think. Of course, when I say rebuilt, I mean, these are very, very poor people. And, they're herdsmen and stuff like that. They don't have much money. And so rebuilding means, they put together 2x4s and they put something over it. They say, this is our village again. And then the Israelis come with a bulldozer and wipe it out, which is much easier to do, of course. And then people put their 2x4s and their lean-tos and their tents and whatever to say, no, this is our village and it's here again, and the Israelis come, etc. But 83 times in the past 5 years. I want to show you a little clip of one of the demolitions. I think it's the first demolition of the village of Araqib, for you to get a sense of, again, what happens when a political abstraction, like, for example, the slogan, "This is Jewish land," which is a slogan that one hears, or "This is our land," or "We claim this land," or "This is Jewish National Fund land," or "This is Israel Land Authority Fund," or whatever choose your abstraction. But when it comes down to the actual concrete world of people's everyday lives, and this is what that looks like. Yeah, it's not the first demolition. You can tell they put together these lean-tos, so it's one of the later demolitions. So 83 times that's happened so far. You have to ask, of course, as I move to a conclusion, well, what kind of resistance is appropriate to this kind of life, to this kind of struggle that's waged at the level of the everyday? And of course, we don't hear that much about the everyday usually in media coverage of Israel and Palestine. We usually hear about, rockets or the Israelis bombing Gaza, large-scale things like large-scale violence. That grabs media attention, but relatively small scale, like this village, that doesn't really register. And these, what's happening here, as I said, is not a unique case. It's just, it happens to be particularly paradigmatic, but it's not unique by any means. So the question is, what sort of resistance is appropriate to a struggle being fought at the level of the everyday? Well, one form of resistance is, of course, to stay put, to refuse to be moved around like so many sheep, which is what the Israelis would prefer. And that, of course, is lived, necessarily at the level of everyday life, because you're saying, I'm not going, I'm staying put. I don't care what you say. I don't care how many times you demolish my shack. I'm not going, I'm staying. That's an act of resistance, of course, that needs to be recognized as such and as important as any other kind of act of resistance. But the act of rebuilding, as they're doing, this is from Araqib, the act of rebuilding is also an act of resistance. So this is where, if you think about it, a bunch of guys putting together 2x4s and saying, this is our village, it seems so small, right? It's almost pathetic how small it is, but it's a very, very important gesture in terms of the larger politically abstract struggle between people claiming land and resisting that claim. The act of farming is immense, especially of olive trees, is also it's an immensely important act of resistance, because the Israelis are trying to demolish and uproot and burn down olive trees well, tending to the trees, watering the trees, fertilizing the trees, taking care of the trees, pruning the trees. Those things which are so, farmers here in Ontario do that every day with their, maybe not olive trees, but whatever people grow in Ontario. It's a very small act, but here it takes on massive political implications, because that's where the struggle is taking place, at the level of the olive branch, literally. Or the act of walking, the act of saying, well, you can put up roadblocks and checkpoints and you can immobilize me and take away my ability to get a permit to drive on your roads, but I'm still going to walk. So the act of walking itself becomes a politically laden gesture, I think. The act of raising children despite all of the difficulties, the act of teaching those children all of these things become hugely significant political acts, because even though they're taking place at the level of the everyday and the banal, the quotidian, nevertheless, they assume great importance in a situation where people are being denied that education or access to education or the right to have an education and so forth. So insisting on educating children, despite all the obstacles that are placed in the way of that education, is itself, that's one of the vectors of Palestinian resistance. And of course, the Israelis are perfectly aware of this. They're completely aware of this, and you could see this particularly in terms of the way in which they deal with schools, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. In the last round of bombing of Gaza, the Israelis damaged 118 schools, according to the UN, of which 22 schools were completely destroyed. These are schools where there were at most people hiding there. There was certainly no, as the UN has manifestly documented, no arms caches and this kind of thing. There's nothing there other than the school itself. But a school becomes subject to military interdiction because of what it represents at some other level, I think, as far as the Israelis are concerned. This is a school in Gaza which at the time was housing refugees subject to phosphorus bombardment. This is not this last time, this is 2008, 2009, this image. And these schools here are after the latest round of bombing in Gaza. So if the classroom for Palestinians is a site of resistance, because educating our children is an important part of our lives as a people and as a community, well then, of course, the classroom then becomes a site for the Israelis to interdict and suspend and cut off and destroy, to the extent that they can, that education and all of that it means. So in all of these circumstances, as I said, the mere fact of steadfastness, or as we say in Arabic, sumud, takes on a whole new meaning. And everyday occupation in that sense demands an everyday resistance, not extraordinary resistance, but everyday resistance. And in fact, the strange thing about it is that the everyday kind of resistance actually has a kind of power and appeal and reach that the more extraordinary, like let's go to the President of the United States or let's talk to the UN or those kinds of diplomatic initiatives actually fail. Palestinians have no power in terms of diplomacy and prestige and so forth at a large-scale diplomatic level. They have no cards to play in terms of, well, if you do this for us, we'll do this for you, because there's nothing they can do politically. It's not like they can then pass some vote through the UN or do whatever countries normally do when they're negotiating. But they do have enormous resources of symbolic power. And those, of course, function not at the level of the extraordinary, but rather, on the contrary, at the level of the everyday and the quotidian. And so everyday marches and protests, the ways in which Palestinians have adapted to the language of international culture, in this case, painting themselves like the indigenous creatures, I've forgotten their names, from that movie, Avatar, a few years ago, to talk about their connection to the land. Using those symbols to be able to reach a global audience has become more and more politically effective, much more effective, I would say, in the long run than waiting for the right kind of extraordinary political intervention to take place, because that doesn't seem to be happening. And there are cases in point that one can think about here. The French company Veolia has become one of the primary targets of the international BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions project. Veolia is constructing a light rail train service inside the occupied West Bank, inside occupied East Jerusalem. And because of its participation in this project, it's been targeted for BDS action. So Veolia is losing contracts all over the world as a response to what it's doing inside the occupied territory. So there's a giant global, but of course always operating in local communities, protest against Veolia. It's all over the world, from England and France and all over Europe to the US, I know in LA, for example, to Australia and other places as well. And the larger BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, has become another way in which the political struggle and the kind of Palestinian resistance against Israel is now operating at a global scale. I think, again, for the future of the struggle, much more powerfully than trying to seal some kind of deal behind closed doors in the White House or Camp David or whatever. And the project to raise global consciousness through the BDS movement has taken on massive form. Not so much in America, although it's beginning to, especially on college campuses. I think to a certain extent in Canada as well, certainly around the world, especially in Europe, where there's a very, very vivid boycott movement. For example, European supermarkets, I know this is the case in England certainly, have to take special precautions to deal with the consumer boycott of goods coming from Israel that are available in supermarkets in England. H&M, the clothing store, has to deal with a boycott directed against it because it manufactures stuff in the West Bank, and so forth. There's a cultural boycott that's going on as well. Very, long established major musicians like Elvis Costello and Brian Eno and Roger Waters and many others have been extremely vocal in their articulation of opposition to playing in Israel. And countless, I can't even remember the list, countless musicians have decided not to play in Israel, as they similarly used to refuse to play in apartheid South Africa. There's a sporting boycott is quickly developing. You may be aware that next week FIFA, the World Football Organization, is going to vote to suspend, hopefully, Israeli membership in FIFA, which would be a massive, truly extraordinary undertaking, because again, it's the kind of thing that, you can talk all you want, but when you start cutting a country off from international circulation, that's when people suddenly sit up and just go, oh, really, this is real now, we can't play football. By the way, did you know that, this is off the topic, but Israel plays in the European League? Did you know it's part of UEFA? It's part of the European Football Federation, not the Asian Federation. So If Israel is suspended from FIFA, that would be a titanic, I think, accomplishment. My favorite example of the sporting boycotts remains, I've talked about this in other places, so I've said this elsewhere, but I'll say it again because it still remains my favorite example, is the Davis Cup tennis match, which took place in Sweden in 2010. It was supposed to be played between an Israeli and a Swedish player in Stockholm, and there was a massive mobilization to protest the presence of an Israeli player playing tennis in Sweden, because it's obviously in contravention of the call to boycott cultural activity, including sports. So at the last minute, the authorities moved the match from Stockholm to Malmo, kind of without telling anybody, so that they could have quickly get the match going, and the protesters hopefully won't show up. The thing is, the protesters did show up, even though it was like literally the day before that they moved the venue. And so outside there was a massive protest, and inside the stadium, as you can see, these two guys are playing tennis, but nobody's watching because of the protest outside. It's as though they have, leprosy or something like that. And that kind of stigmatization, what does it do? It doesn't hurt anybody. It is the ultimate form of nonviolent protest, but it's very, very, very powerful, as the case of South Africa showed. And I think that resonates here as well. I think I'll stop here and see if you have questions about this and about the politics of difference that takes place at an everyday level, and the ways in which we can think about both occupation at the everyday level, but then of course resistance at the level of the everyday as well. Thank you. Yes?
20 years ago, there was a Jeanette Armstrong, who's with the Okanagan First Nation, and she made the comment that in the Americas, there's not a single nation that is an indigenous nation state. And so the closest nation that comes to that now would be Bolivia. And not without a lot of problems from the United States government and whatever. But when you talk about ethnic cleansing, there are historical precedents throughout the Americas of that. And you only have to go back to the 1830s with President Jackson's removal of all First Nations peoples to Oklahoma, or the 1890s, let's say, in Minnesota, where the Ho-Chunk people, the Winnebago, were removed to Wisconsin. And then every time they were removed, they walked back up to Minnesota. They did it 3 times until it became so dangerous, because the settlers were shooting them, killing them. And I made the comment to a Ho-Chunk artist recently. I said, well, it's sort of like the Palestinians. And he said, oh yeah, it's the same, exactly the same. They shoot Palestinians. Well, they shot us.
Yeah.
So the ethnic cleansing has a historical precedent, not just in the United States, but throughout the Americas, including Canada.
Yeah, of course. There's no question.
Yeah.
And there's been some very interesting scholarship on the relationship between the kind of process of what happened, especially in the U.S., to Native Americans, and and to think through the relationship between America's relationship to its own past and to its indigenous population, and what's going on in Israel and Palestine today. Stephen Saleta works on this question exactly, for example, and it's which is extremely, of course it's very important, and of course there are all kinds of affinities between Palestinians and Native Americans on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border, and of course in South America as well. No question.
We recently, the Prime Minister of Canada, Harper, he made an apology to First Nations vis-a-vis the residential schools travesty, and he was pretty well forced to do that because of Jack Layton, who was the head of the NDP at the time before he died. And the sad thing is that Harper, Prime Minister of Canada, apologizes for the residential schools, but then he turns around and against the will of the First Nations of Canada, he starts changing their educational systems so they don't have any control anymore. He goes after their environmental disputes, right, with corporations.
Right.
I mean, it's continuing.
Yes, I mean, no doubt. Yeah, the Palestinian case is by no means unique historically. That's for sure. And as these cases remind us, all of these forms of contestation also take place at the level of the everyday. It's by no. I'm not trying to say Palestine is a unique case, but you're right. The affinities are certainly there, and they are very resonant and powerful. No question.
When you started your talk, I mean, you talked about yourself as an indigenous person, and I think that's relevant. But when a Palestinian calls himself indigenous, the Israelis flip out because they don't want comparisons between what happened, let's say, in the Americas, because that's what they're doing.
Well, it's interesting. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Back in the days when you could think of cowboys and Indians, stereotypically, and in Hollywood movies from the 50s and 60s and so forth, then actually it was very useful to think of Palestinians as Indians because, they're the wild savages with you can't understand their language and they're going crazy and circling wagons, and the Israelis are the ones in the wagon, etc. So there's a way in which there are forms of affiliation and reversal that they do actually want to latch onto. But these days, when it's become impolitic to talk about, getting rid of entire population and exterminating people and wrapping their children in smallpox blankets and this kind of thing, yeah, that of course we don't mention that stuff and try to cover up those kinds of connections. But they're certainly there. There's no question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Just to continue on that point, one of the things now that it's impolitic, Zionist propaganda in Canada tries to take Aboriginal youth to Israel and buy into the idea that they're Aboriginal, they're indigenous people as well. So they sell them this myth, and they sell it, in a very seductive way.
Right.
One of the ways that we're countering that is making sure that there's not just from this hemisphere, but from different parts of the world, an indigenous presence on the next flotilla that will sail to Gaza next month.
Right.
So that it would be indigenous people saying this is an indigenous issue from different places. But I appreciate very much that you talked about the day-to-day thing. It doesn't quite happen day-to-day, but what people need to know is those images of the JNF are paid for here, in part. Right? This is, unlike, it used to be the case you could get a charitable donation in Canada for paying for a church that was running a clearly racist residential school. It's no longer the case. It is now unique that the only organization that can get a charitable donation in this country or anywhere else in the world for a policy that's clearly racist, that says this land belongs to one ethnic religious group but not to others. You couldn't do that in Canada. But that, you get people donate to that and get charitable receipts here, which we all pay for through our taxes, right? And that is unique. There's no other charity anywhere in the world that can raise money for a clearly racist, discriminatory practice. And it's raised in this community. Next month, on the 23rd of June, they're holding a banquet here in London. And they do it every year it was just one in Vancouver. And so that's the funding part, and the ideological part is they honor a Canadian in the community. And they just get people to buy into this.
Oh, and there's a Canada forest,
There's
I think.
a Canada forest. One of those
One of those
forests
ones.
that destroys is the
Canada
forest.
Park. Maybe that's what it is.
Canada Park, which masks three villages. One of them is the biblical Emmaus, was in Rome too, right? But two others.
Yeah.
But they also very clever about co-opting people, including the former president of this university, Paul Davenport, who was honoree at one of the annual JNF banquets, right? Some colleagues here didn't think it was so honorable, and sorry, those were real quick airports, right? Some colleagues here didn't think it was so honorable and called him on it. So if you're interested in calling the JNF on raising funds here, I mean, it's not an everyday, but it is literally an every year act of resistance. It's just to remind Canadians that we're paying for those kids seeing their family shacks being destroyed time and time and time again, right? In the name of greening or whatever,
Right.
whatever.
Making the desert bloom.
Yeah, they put an environmental gloss on it. In this case, they're putting a humanitarian hospital healthcare gloss on it. They try to find a nice way to gloss it up, but ultimately that's what we're paying for through our taxes and what we're tolerating here in our communities.
Yeah.
So that's something that is not quite the same kind of act of resistance, but it's here where we live.
Well, the point is the point is the convergence of all these acts of resistance. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, the UN isn't going to intervene, the US certainly isn't going to intervene, the EU is twiddling its thumbs, it'll go on doing that. But these forms of action on the part of citizens around the world, as was the case in South Africa too, can produce transformation that governments don't want to see happen. But yeah, I think each of these things, is small in and of itself. As I said, two people throwing a two by fours together, putting a tarp over them. It's a tiny gesture, but it actually, multiply that by a million, and that's a lot. I think. Yeah.
Sorry. So sorry, Jamila. Just because you mentioned the olive trees, which is a stunning act of resistance to plant an olive tree. You can support that. You can't get a tax receipt for it, but you can support that through something olive oil and Trees of Life in Canada, right? So if you're interested in planting olive trees, there's been 1 million to 2 million trees uprooted and burned, and people still plant them, which just gobstacks me.
Yeah.
People still plant olive trees, but it's a beautiful thing, and it's something that we can support.
Yes.
Sorry. Just wait a second. Go on to something else.
Okay. Yeah.
So BDS is an act of everyday resistance that we can engage in here. But I heard recently that the Canadian government is contemplating adding that as an act of terrorism, which is sort of mind-blowing. What do you think of?
You know more about the Canadian government than I do. What can I say? But I could.
The notion of BDS as
an act. The thing is.
All resistance is terrorism.
Yeah, well, that's yes, there's that, of course. There's in the U.S. now. It's not exactly the same thing, but the big struggle that's taking place right now is over the term anti-Semitism, which anybody who's dealt with this question for a long time knows if you start being critical of Israeli policy, you get accused of being an anti-Semite, et cetera, et cetera. But now it's come down to actually kind of almost juridical definitions of the term. So the big movement on college campuses across the U.S. I'm actually writing a piece for the LA Times about this now. Is to mobilize at the legislative level, but also at the level of addressing universities, administrations, and so forth. Is to have universities, what's the word? Embrace the U.S. State Department definition of anti-Semitism, and then make that university policy. And the interesting thing you may have heard about this, but the U.S. State Department definition of anti-Semitism refers to an EU definition of anti-Semitism, which the EU devised, I can't remember when, but then they discarded it. They said this can't possibly work. But the U.S. State Department, it kept the definition, and it's one of these very, very stretchy definitions that includes what's the phrase it uses? Demonization of Israel. And something else, delegitimization of the state of Israel as anti-Semitic acts. Of course, then, what does it mean to demonize? Well, as far as these people are concerned, as soon as you say anything critical about Israel, that's demonization, right? So, therefore, if these things get implemented, doing what I just did would be an anti-Semitic act, right? Or saying, but they're planting forests on people's houses. That's an anti-Semitic act. Or saying 2,279 calories for Gaza. That's an anti-Semitic act. Or saying anything really becomes an anti-Semitic act. So there are struggles taking place now, at the level of dictionary definitions. Which in a way is terrifying, horrifying, and very deeply disturbing, because this would involve government surveillance and censorship and all this kind of thing. But on the other hand, one doesn't want to be too optimistic. On the other hand, if they're now fighting over dictionary definitions, then they must be pretty desperate, I think, right? So there's a silver lining to the cloud that this is what it's now come down to, is how do you define a particular word? Well, okay, let's fight over definitions. I think we could pretty much win that fight, I think. So yeah. But yeah, in terms of these other things like BDS or defining it as a crime or not a crime and stuff, with criminalizing it, etc. Those are major issues. There's no way around it. And they obviously need to be contested and resisted and stopped if possible. Yes.
I just wondering a couple of things, but I'll just focus on one. Do you think the Vatican's recognition of Palestine is of any significance? I mean, the fact that they do have that incredible residence in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean,
and that I was actually surprised at how dominant it was when I made my visit, because I think that
in Jerusalem, yeah.
in Jerusalem. So
Yeah.
I mean, this whole kind of relationship to the fundamentalist Christian as opposed to the Vatican.
Yeah.
And what the Vatican position is in terms of recognizing Palestine. Because so many people say to me, well, look at
Yes,
What's
exactly.
the one you're looking at?
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
and then the other thing was like the whole kind of situation of the two-state as opposed to the one-state. Are we going to get to the one-state?
Oh, I think, frankly, I
We're
think.
gonna get
Oh, I think we're already there. I mean, there's no.
Yeah, the
As far as
two-state
I'm
is
concerned,
just-
that's that's fantasy. I mean, really, the two-state solution. First of all, literally the geographical space for it no longer exists
Right. And it
because
was
the space
just
has all been colonized.
It really was just a ploy.
It was a ploy.
It was a ploy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, certain Palestinians may have believed in it.
Yeah.
Some of them may still believe in it.
Yeah.
But there's no way. It's not the geographically. There's no basis for it. And then again, I've argued this elsewhere, but I'll say it again. Even if there were a two-state solution, I mean, even if you take the ultimate two-state solution, which is no way on anybody's agenda, but by which I mean the dismantlement of all Israeli settlements, the removal of all Israeli fortifications and controls over borders and airspace and water and the electromagnetic sphere, etc., etc. Really, all that, and it's a real state. And there's like an impregnable tunnel between the West Bank and Gaza that Israelis can't stop, and the whole thing. And they have East Jerusalem. Really, go all the way. That addresses the needs and rights of about 40% of the Palestinian population, at best. That leaves the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, 1 million plus inside Israel, and all the refugees, about 5 million people, disenfranchised and totally cut adrift. In fact, the ones inside Israel are even worse off. So, yeah, I mean, even in the ultimate version, which nobody is even remotely talking about, of a two-state solution, it still wouldn't do anything. And what we're talking about is nowhere near the ultimate. It's much, much more, I don't know what the word is to talk about. It's a pastiche of a two-state solution that's left. It's over. There's no way. So what we have is, in fact, one state. It has always been one state. There aren't two states. There's only been one state. And the one state is a state that that governs over roughly equal populations between Jews and Palestinians, and yet one people has rights and privileges and the other one doesn't. It's as simple as that. It's actually very, very, very simple. So that's the other thing to speak about, this question of simplicity and complication. Because it's often raised when you talk about this thing, one of the objections that frequently comes up, oh, this is so complicated, there's a long history and so forth. It's like, yeah, it's complicated, but it's actually not that complicated. It's actually pretty simple. There are two people living in one piece of land, and one people has rights and the other one doesn't. That's actually all you need to know, really. And so what kind of political arrangement can you imagine whereby both peoples have equal rights? And that tells you what kind of state you need. So it's pretty straightforward.
I guess that goes back to like the nation state, like for instance our example of Canada that Ron was talking about,
Yeah.
where First Nation people in Canada continue to live in that state of difference that you talk about.
Yeah.
Which is the huge issue for us that we're trying to
Yes.
deal with here,
Right.
along with the international questions
Right.
that you're raising. So it's a constant, I think, for us to sort of
It's a major
bring
issue.
that together.
One of the big differentiators, though, between this case and the other case, the case of Palestine, is that the populations are about equal. It's about 50-50, which is not the case here in North America because of the exterminations of the earlier periods. Right? So the Israelis didn't exterminate Palestinians, which some of them explicitly say was a mistake. Historian, what's his name? Benny Morris has said that. They should have gone on with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I mean, that is killing people, or at least forcibly expelling them, if not actually killing them. And they didn't. They left, as Benny Morris says, too many people behind. And so now that's 1 million plus people inside Israel, then 4.5 million or whatever in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, and then 5 million refugees. Those people all exist. They're not going away. They're not abstractions. They're 10 million, 11 million people. And, they have rights and they will keep struggling for their rights. So yeah, I think that makes it a different case than many of the other comparable cases like the Aborigines in Australia, a similar thing, right? But the ratios are, again, not.
Bolivia.
But yeah. I mean, there are a few places where it's not quite like that, but yeah. But you had a question about the Vatican. I was going to say something about that. The Vatican, I think it is symbolically very interesting. I don't know what it'll do politically, but it's symbolically significant, I think. Although, as I recall, when the Israelis were laying siege to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem,
Yeah, right.
the Vatican didn't say anything. And you think this is
Different pope.
this is what it's all about. It was a different pope. And where's the Vatican when they're bombing the Church of the Nativity? Well, yeah, it was a different pope. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I think I agree with you, and I think most people that have any sense of awareness that there is a world that exists outside of North America will say that the logic has been rigged, and everyone's known this for a long time. It's just that we keep spinning the same wheels. When you describe the situation, it seems like the discourse that the register that you were working in was a very Hegelian register. There's abstraction, there's concrete, and then there's the real. Hegel famously called the Muslims, the Mohammedans, enthusiasts for the abstract, and he thought that that's what led to their fanaticism. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how that type of abstraction is now being used on the other side by the Jewish sort of lobby in this case. And how we need to change, we just need to get out of that mode in order to understand resistance, I think. I think if we keep talking about resistance from within the sort of the banality of the everyday, within this greater scheme that's taking place, I don't think we get anywhere.
I think we do, but I mean, I take your point.
Well, I understand,
right.
like,
It's the point is how to make how to connect these two things.
Right.
That's what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, for example, pick an abstraction. Refugees. That's the number one abstraction. Because you often hear in discussions, two-state solution or other kind of political formulations, the refugees, and you know, that becomes an abstraction, of course. The refugees, they end up being like, you know, counters you can move around on a playing board. And of course, refugees are people. They have lives, they have families, they have communities, they have links. They're real, actual, living human beings. But they're reduced to a political chit that you can move around. So an abstraction, in other words. So I think, for example, giving a face and a name to a refugee, concretizing the abstraction, bringing the abstraction down to earth, saying that's what a refugee. These people are refugees. These are their stories. This is what they have to say. They're living, sentient human beings, not just a political abstraction. I think it becomes very important.
Because what gets sold is a story.
Yes, well, for example, yeah. But it also makes it harder for people to live in the realm of the abstract, or Israel's favorite word, security. Security. I mean, that's an abstraction, of course. But when you strip it of its abstractedness, and say this is what it means. This is what it means to be at a checkpoint. This is what it looks like. This is how it works. This is what it looks like from the inside out. I think that does damage to the abstract. So I think in many cases, abstractions rely for their efficacy on an evacuation of the actual, and bringing the actual back into the picture then pushes away, or limits, the political efficacy of the abstract. That's how I see it anyway. But it's a matter of connecting these two things together, because you don't want to just leave it at the level of the
I'm ready to leave it.
no, you don't leave it at the level of the quotidian.
To be gained out of a Hegelian system.
No, neither do I. I didn't mean to. I hope I didn't come off as a Hegelian. That wasn't the point. But the point is to be able to connect these two worlds of abstract discourse and
But
say
isn't
yes.
that the two-state solution? Isn't
No,
that
why?
precisely the utopia or the fantasy of the two-state solution that's being sold, that we can connect it and
No.
connecting it
Because that's the whole point. So the two-state solution is an abstract discourse. If you say, okay, let's talk about it really. Where is this other state going to be? What's it going to look like? Who's going to live there? How will it function? How will people come and go, etc. But then the whole thing dissolves because it can't be. There won't be such a space. There can't be such a space. It doesn't exist anymore. And even if it existed, as I said, it doesn't really. It's not even a Band-Aid. It doesn't do anything. So it's like a Band-Aid without the part that covers the actual wound. It sticks onto the wound and makes it worse. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of being able to strip away those kinds of abstraction. Yeah, I think that's important. Yes.
Can I ask about the manifestation of this? So, what do people do with their IDs, the passbooks, right? I'm familiar with in South Africa. There's two things that they did. In the 70s, one of the things that you could do was replace your photo on the passbook and therefore have access to a different kind of life. Maybe not one that's better, maybe not one that's stable for a long time. Maybe somebody's going to find you out, but this is a mode of survival simple rejection of all kind of abstractions, and this to refocus the identity on the person who was already there.
Right.
And it was very violent, right? It was violent back and forth.
Right.
But those are the two things that I'm aware of what people did in South Africa
Right.
with their passports. I'm just wondering what people do.
Well, let's talk about the South African thing first. That's an important point. The thing about South Africa is that so there are many points of comparison between Israeli and South African forms of apartheid, but there's a huge difference, and the huge difference is that South African apartheid was about the exploitation of black labor.
Right.
That's what it's all about. So then to withhold your services, that's what they want. After all, the apartheid regime wants your labor.
Right.
What the big difference is that Israelis don't want Palestinian labor. They want Palestinians to go away. So there's that in that sense, if Palestinians withdraw, the Israelis would go, great, you've withdrawn. It's even better. You've disappeared. We don't want to see you. That's the problem. So it's not a question of, it's a question of actually of assertion into rather than a withdrawal or a negation or a withholding of labor in the case of South Africa. That's a huge difference. The South African state couldn't have survived without black labor. So then it was a question for the South African state of how do we get the labor, how do we have our cake and eat it too, basically? How do we get the labor but not give these people their rights? The Israelis don't want Palestinian labor. They don't want Palestinians. They just want the land without the people. And that's been since 48, since before 48. So that makes the dynamic of how do you resist it different, precisely because of that discrepancy. Even though, if you go through all of the South African apartheid laws, and I've done this elsewhere, and you compare them to the Israeli institution of apartheid, which has very subtle differences, but if you go through systematically, like I've forgotten the South African laws, the housing laws and the marriage laws and so forth, you go through them all, they're Israeli equivalents, every single one, right? Point by point. So, but with this big difference about needing labor and not wanting people. That didn't quite answer your question. Although I think it sort of changed maybe changed the contours of the question to a certain extent. But the other thing is that in terms of literally the card itself, the card only has any kind of value, so to speak. It only carries significance insofar as it matches the registry that the Israeli soldier at the checkpoint has available to him. So you can do what you want to the card. If it doesn't fit what he has in front of him, it's useless. And the only way to change what he has in his registry is to gain access to the official population registry for both the West Bank and Gaza, by the way, and East Jerusalem, of course, which the Israelis control, ultimately. So that's the thing. But all this talk about Israel withdrawing from Gaza in 2005, they still control the population registry for Gaza. So a Palestinian in Gaza, to get his or her ID, still has to go through the Israelis ultimately. And like as I said, the card by itself doesn't mean anything. And so yeah, you can burn your card, but you're not going to be able to get to work or get to your farm or go see your kids or get to school or whatever the thing is, right? So that changes the dynamic hugely, I think. So yeah, does that help answer the question? Yes.
So we all know how the Arab states are divided on this issue of Israeli occupation in Palestine, and different states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, they have different kind of relationship with Israel. So this politics of difference that you're talking about, can we take it inside the Arab states and see how the politics of difference vis-a-vis Palestine has sustained this occupation?
Yeah, well, that's an important point. Although, I think the most important point to make is that you're talking about Arab governments.
Yeah, the Arab states here.
The governments themselves. I mean, the states mixes government with people, obviously, but the people are uniform in their position. It's the governments that have differing points of view, and of course, they're pretty much, with the exception of Lebanon, autocratic regimes, all of them, right? So in that case, what they represent is their own narrow sectarian interest. And these days, as you pointed out, the Saudis, for example, are busy bombing Yemen now. Never in the 60 years of war between Arabs and Israel did the Saudis ever bomb Israel, as far as I know. But they're busy bombing a fellow Arab country. They bombed Iraq, they bombed Syria, They bombed, I think, in Libya, and you know when that took place a couple of years ago. So you know, there's no question that from the perspective of these autocratic Arab regimes, they are much more comfortable with the Israelis. But that's because they think, the governments, that is, not the people, think of their interest as aligning with a certain kind of political axis that depends upon depriving people of rights and keeping populations subject to control and coercion, basically. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to think about it. That does not go for the Arab people, any of them, all of them, who don't see things in that way. And that's 300 million people. So, you know, what's going to happen in the Arab world, nobody knows, because it's changing before our very eyes. The whole landscape that we grew up with, that I grew up with, certainly, is not what it used to be. So I don't know nobody knows what's going to happen in the next few years with any of these Arab countries, and what they'll look like, even Yemen, even Saudi Arabia itself. But think about Syria and Iraq; those are very much both up for grabs. Libya, Tunisia to a certain extent, Egypt even. I mean, nobody knows, right? So it's impossible to say where this will go in the next few years. Yes?
I mean, you touched on actually a few things here. Like, I just want to go comments on a couple things. I mean, the first thing is,
Can you speak up a bit, sir?
so, I mean, about the two-state solution that one of you mentioned, we all understand that's not actually realistic. But at the same time, the one-state solution is even more non-realistic, because the first people who would be actually opposing and fighting that would be the Israelis. Because, you know, as we learned from the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, it was basically actually to escape the administrative and financial and other obligations that any commission has towards the people. And as you said, there are actually 20% of the Israeli citizens are Arabs, right? And they've been treated as second class or even third class citizens. So what I'm thinking is that basically, if we all sit around the table and then we propose the one-state solution, I'd say that the Israelis would be the first to raise their hands and oppose that. The second point is actually.
Should I take the first one first, and then you can do the second one, so I keep it in my head? Okay.
You can go.
Yeah, no, the first one, I mean, that's an objection that's often raised, and I'll give you the answer that my kind of standard answer to the question, because it's a question that I've often come across, which is that it doesn't matter what the Israelis want and don't want. It simply does not matter. It's not what they want. It's never historically in the history of the world have people in a position of power and privilege ever once given up power and privilege because they wanted to. Never. It's never happened. It's never going to happen. It happens when they have to do it, and that's going to be. The Israelis are not from outer space. They're not. They're like anybody else. They will give up their privileges when they are compelled to give up their privileges. I believe in nonviolent compulsion. That's why I think BDS is very important. But it's when they have to, they will. If you ask them, please, 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 for their human rights, and there's this and that, they're going to say, well, we don't care.
What do you think they would prefer, actually? What do you think they would prefer?
What do I think? What?
What do you think they would prefer in terms of the two-state? Yeah, in terms of the
Oh,
two-state
it depends on who you ask. The ones that are, like the Libanese and so forth, who are thinking slightly ahead of the ball, are thinking, or all people like Olmert, for example, they're thinking, and they're slightly cannier than the one who's running the place now. They're thinking, if we can create something called the Palestinian state, even if it's fictional, we could say, here, you have your state, go away. And the world will say, oh, it's a Palestinian state, blah, 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 and therefore, so forth, it's good, it'll be over. Even though nothing actually changes on the ground, or very little changes other than rearranging of some, border things and a flag or two here and there. But nominally, it would be a Palestinian state. So in that sense, the cleverer Israelis are thinking along those lines. They've now become, in fact, not just, if you look, it's bizarre that the biggest advocates of the two-state solution now are Israelis, not Palestinians. Well, why? Because they've realized if they don't have that, then it's the end game of the one-state solution. This is their last alternative. And it won't be a real, this is why it can't actually work in the long run. In the short run, it could work because with enough distraction of the international community and so forth, it could take some of the fizz off BDS and so forth, because people say, well, now the occupation is over, there is a Palestinian state, hey, the game is over, etc. Of course it wouldn't be, but it takes a lot to mobilize the world, in the first place. But most Israelis don't think like that. Certainly the current government doesn't think like that. And so the weird thing is, in fact, precisely because of their sheer physical power and their ability to coerce or not coerce, their ability to cajole other governments like Canada, the US, or whatever in Europe to their side, they've actually written themselves into the corner. They have no choice. They've created the circumstances of the one-state solution, much more than Palestinians could have done. These Israelis that have enabled the one-state solution to come about. So then the only question is, since what we have now on the ground, both in the occupied territories and, as you know, inside Israel itself, is an apartheid regime, the only question is how long will it last as such? And then after that, we'll see. So that's what it comes down to. But you're right, your first point is right, that they're never going to accept it willingly. But as I said, if you look at the history of transformation, including South Africa, the South African regime didn't give up because somebody said, "Oh, there's this guy Nelson Mandela. He's a great poet." And, that's not what it was at all, right? And, in the period Tilotam and I work on, in the 19th century in Britain, the main struggle then was about attaining democratic rights for the people of Britain, and the aristocracy didn't want to give up its privileges, its inherited privileges, and it didn't give them up willingly. It was forced to give them up after decades and decades of struggle that the people undertook to gain the democratic rights. So, as I said, people in a position of power and privilege never voluntarily renounce their privileges just because it's the good thing or the right thing to do. They have to be forced to do it.